Thanks again for joining us at the Information Literacy Summit. This is Breakout Room D. My name is Jill King. I'm a librarian at DePaul University in Chicago. I'm going to be moderating this session along with my colleague at DePaul, Joel Sanders. So feel free to message us in the chat if you need anything during the session. And feel free to use the chat for just general discussion, for questions for our presenters. They will leave some time at the end of their talk to address questions. So let's get started right away. I'm really pleased to introduce our two presenters for this session, Reanna Esmail and Ashley Shea from Cornell University in their session, Teaching Algorithmic Literacy. Thank you both for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you for that introduction. We wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homes of the Guyacona, the Cayuga Nation. The Guyacona are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guyacona dispossession and honor the ongoing connections of Guyacona people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And so I also wanted to frame the presentation a little bit. So in this presentation, we will introduce some strategies for teaching algorithmic literacy. It was really great to hear Dr. Sweeney's wonderful keynote about algorithmic literacies as praxis. In our practice, we want to support various kinds of literacies. Since most students access information primarily through digital means, in order to understand the information they are consuming, they need to understand the digital space it exists within. Thus, digital literacy and information literacy for us are two sides of the same coin. Information literacy is algorithmic literacy. Digital literacy is information literacy. We will define algorithms and algorithmic systems, and following that, we will introduce active learning activities that allow students to reflect on the effects that algorithms have on their information consumption, and we'll conclude the session with strategies to critically engage students in questions about equitable information access and privacy rights. In presenting how we teach algorithmic literacy, we hope to prompt discussion of other strategies and methods for engaging students in the information pipeline.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the learning outcomes that we have for this session. These learning outcomes align quite closely with the outcomes that we have that inform the classes that we teach. So both Reanna and I teach credit-bearing courses on the Cornell campus, and we also teach our fair share of the one-shots, the guest lectures. And so we've taught this notion of algorithmic literacy in various capacities. So in our own credit-bearing courses, but also as guest lecturers in the classes of others. And so when we do these sessions for students, what we think is most important aligns with what we hope will be important in a thread throughout the conversation together today, understanding what we mean when we talk about algorithms and the distinctions between 3 various types of algorithmic systems. We want students to recognize the various and complex ways in which bias influences these algorithms, with some notable examples that have significant real-world effects that they may have experienced themselves or others that they know. We want students to understand how to evaluate algorithms and the influence that they have on information discovery so they themselves can be critical consumers of information. An important point is that though we often are talking about academic resources, we recognize that students are evaluating all sorts of information, not just for academic purposes, but as their role in society today as they encounter news, images, etc. And so we want students to feel equipped to navigate information resources that they might encounter for information scholarly purposes, but also information in their own personal endeavors. So we also want students to be able to apply techniques and tools that can help limit algorithmic influence, and we'll talk a bit about that, and recognize how algorithmic literacy intersects with issues of privacy rights and this notion of digital citizenship, which is important, and we'll talk about that at the end.
So to get started, what is an algorithm? We use this definition, which is algorithms are pieces of code that solve a problem created by people. We could define it in this way because it's indicating both that the problems are created by people, so sort of grounding this in socioeconomic issues, and then also that the code itself is created by people. So also allowing us to talk a little bit about blind spots in code and how sometimes they may not do what they're intended to do. An example that I like to use a lot is the founding of Uber. The founder of Uber actually said that they created Uber to solve traffic congestion in major cities. Anyone who's used Uber knows that it didn't actually do that. It actually contributed to traffic. So providing some like examples of things that students use all the time can kind of help them think through ways that algorithms work. We generally frame the sessions around search engines and recommendation systems. And this framing helps us sort of historicize algorithms. We can talk about the history of the internet, which prior to being networked together and instantly accessible, prior to the internet, information was more difficult to find. If you needed help finding a resource, you had to go to a library. Additionally, original search engines used PageRank based on library cataloged information retrieval systems. And then as more information became available online, it was harder to just use library PageRank. And so they started increasingly using personalization, but part of the reason for this is because users were omitting relevant search terms and including non-essential search terms. So this is a way that we can bring it back to the library, because as every instruction librarian knows, teaching search competency is really important, and we can kind of contextualize the reason why libraries are interested in this. Another thing that I like to always point out to students is that it's really important to emphasize that most of these algorithms are proprietary and black box algorithms. So we know bits and pieces about them from research and press, and we don't know so much about their output because a lot of it happens screen by screen.
So when talking about this with students, we like to complicate it actually for them. So they hear about algorithms, they have a sense that algorithms influence the information that they see. They're all aware of this. The ways in which that happens, though, is more opaque for students. And so we try to introduce the idea that not all algorithms are the same. And in fact, there are 3 distinct algorithmic system types. Those types are what we call consequential, and it's not terms that Reanna or I came up with. This is well written about in the literature, emerging from law actually as a field. But there's consequential algorithms, there's preferential algorithmic systems, and then there's what you sometimes hear of as preemptive or presumptive algorithmic systems. Consequential is putting the most choice in front of the user. The goals of the user are really what are dictating those choices and the kind of information later presented. So an example here of consequential algorithmic systems that we're all aware of is PubMed, academic databases in general, but PubMed and the underlying Medline database that some of you might be familiar with is a really great and compelling example of the values of consequential databases. Consequential algorithmic systems in particular. Now, why this is so good is because consequential algorithmic systems expose the underlying infrastructure. So you have a sense of the metadata fields that are being weighted, how they're being indexed, how they are then exposed to the search engine. So when you then see the results, you know why those results are appearing. I happen to have a few colleagues that work at the National Library of Medicine, and they are working actually on this very system, this indexing system. Why I find this such a compelling example to show to students is there are so many open source online tutorials that tell us as users of Medline how the information record for each publication indexed within this database is incorporated into the system. What fields are relevant, what fields are weighted more than others. We understand how mesh terms are applied, medical subject headings. There's a lot of clarity here. There's a lot of transparency here. So when we make this discussion with students about why some algorithmic systems actually aren't inherently problematic or are less problematic perhaps than others, it's important to talk about consequential and the distinction between the other two. As we go through here, Reanna is going to talk about preferential, but as we go through, one thing that I think is important for students, but us as well, to be mindful of is that the focus on the user and the agency of the user gets less important the further down we get. So consequential is what we would say is the most focused on users' needs, users' goals when seeking information.
And so just to recap, preferential utilize past search behavior and online persona to recommend relevant results to the end users. So one example that I like to show students is these Signal ads. And if folks aren't familiar with Signal, it is an encrypted messaging platform, kind of like an alternative to WhatsApp. These were ads that they tried to post on Instagram, and all of the information that you kind of see highlighted in the darker blue color is information that Instagram and Facebook, I guess Meta now, gave them. So I like to usually walk through the students through like one of the ads and how exactly they would have gotten this information. Like they would probably know that you listen to K-pop from your streams on Spotify or on Apple Music. They would know your location based on location services. And if you had a new baby, maybe there was a registry for the baby, or even people in your circle maybe were looking for baby gifts.
So the last kind is preemptive. Again, sometimes you might refer to this as presumptive. This is where the focus moves from what the anticipated goals are or the stated goals of the user are, and instead moves the focus away to presumptions on what the user's level of risk might pose to the state, to the company, etc. These are the most opaque algorithmic systems that are available. So if we again recall the consequential being a bit more transparent, preferential, less transparent, making assumptions, but those assumptions are based on past behavior under the guise of it being helpful to the end user. Preemptive is a clear distinction in that it's not meant to be helpful to the end user. It's meant actually to be helpful to the company, to the state, to mitigate risk. So this is where we think about no-fly lists, the interest rates from loan companies. And so when talking about this with students, we talk about, Reanna, if you want to go to the next slide, we talk about a lot of ways in which this is manifesting in society today. One important one is the mortgage approval algorithms that are used by banks in particular. So some of you might be familiar with the FICO score, the classic FICO score used when determining loans to potential home buyers, for example. Those algorithms used to determine FICO scores are notoriously difficult to assess. We do know that it is built on data that was used and collected in the 1990s. That's outdated data. We also know that the FICO score is using traditional markers of wealth that have historically benefited white populations and marginalized people of color. Really good example of how this shows up in the data that's used when assessing a FICO score is thinking about good credit behavior, paying your bills on time, and bad credit behavior, not paying your bills on time. And when you think about the streams of data that are feeding into this particular algorithmic code for determining a FICO score, you start to understand that if the data is inherently problematic when it enters the system, it's going to inherently lead to problems when it exits the system. And so that's precisely what's happening in here. And a good example that I give the students when I talk about this particular example is when we look at communities where people of color tend to live, we see a lack of banks. We see a lack of credit unions. Instead, what we see are more payday loan servicers that have traditionally higher rates when you miss payments. And so the other thing to know about those payday loaners is that they only are reporting to credit bureaus when payments are missed. They're not reporting good behavior, unlike banks and credit unions that report both good and bad. So understanding the data that feeds into this and how that then informs the ultimate decisions made once it's fed into this is really important. And of course, I'm sure many of you have other relevant examples. This is just one, and a plug for the markup. If this is not a source that you're aware of, I show this to students. This is, you can follow the links at the end of our presentation. This is an interactive feature where you can actually plug in locations in the US and see what is the actual distribution rate here. So for every person for every white person that's getting a loan, how many people of color are denied? And so you could put it in your zip code, or not all zip codes are included here, but you could put in a general area in which you've resided if you're interested. So students find this very troubling and compelling, and very few, if any, knew about this. So it's an interesting example to use.
So now we're going to kind of get into, I think, probably one of the points the students are most interested in, but also the part that they kind of know the least about in practice. They tend to see the headlines about how bias plays out in algorithms, but they may not see the larger systemic issues or how this affects their everyday information consumption. These algorithms, particularly these search engine and recommendation system algorithms, are built for engagement and viral advertising, not necessarily accurate information sharing. So some additional examples I like to give students are, so the first one is Tay tweets. If anyone's familiar with Tay, this was a 16-year-old chatbot, 16-year-old girl chatbot that Microsoft created in 2016. As Dr. Sweeney talked about earlier in her presentation, the choice to make a 16-year-old girl on the internet is an interesting one, and obviously shows there was some blind spots from the programmers when creating this. But I really like this example for showing students because a lot of times these algorithms can be proprietary or black box algorithms. So we don't know so much about the data being fed into them and then the outputs happening from the algorithm, because a lot of it is screen by screen, loan by loan, or feed by feed. So the thing I like about this one is this AI learned from interactions on Twitter. Very early on when Microsoft announced this, it was picked up by the part of the internet known as 4chan. And so Tay was sort of flooded with some problematic content. And what you saw over time was the tweets become increasingly racist and xenophobic and like incredibly sexualized. And I think it's I do think it's a good example for students because you can kind of see that change. And it's also important to note that Microsoft did launch another AI after this called Zoe, and Zoe now refuses to talk about anything related to what Microsoft deems problematic. So if you tweet at Zoe about your bar mitzvah, Zoe will not respond because they are worried that it could be anti-Semitic. So it also shows that sometimes these, instead of finding a solution to contextualize data coming in, instead they're kind of just blocking it off. Another example is the work of Dr. Sophia Noble, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but I think that students really are interested in this example because a lot of times when they see things coming to them in resources like Google, they don't really take a long time to evaluate the process through which that information is being shown to them and how that's both shaped by the bias of the dominant groups that have given that information, but also by the bias of marketing and the commercialization of information. As Dr. Noble makes clear in her book, sex sells, and part of the reason why there is a sexualization of young Black girls is because it's sold and people were interacting with that information. And then the algorithm itself just kind of learns that's what people want to see. And so it gets harder and harder to break that bias. That bias instead becomes amplified. And so now we're going to move on to activities, and Ashley's going to start us off.
Yeah, so when talking about this with students, it's one thing to show them how this manifests in their daily life. It's one thing to, give them really important and awful effects of these algorithms. It's another to actually have them see firsthand how this is influential in their own lives. So Reanna, if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk a bit about this exercise that we do. Again, work of the markup. So I'm really plugging them here because I think what they do is so important. But they've done many really interesting projects over the past several years. They are a fairly new nonprofit data journalism organization that's really trying to help hold big tech accountable. Their job is we are watching tech and they are not being watched by anyone else. That's why we are doing it. That's why this is important. So this was a project that they launched about a year and a half ago, and it's called the Citizen Browser Project. And what this is a plugin that they developed that they were then paying Facebook users to install, they being the markup, paid Facebook users to install in their web browser that they would then use when searching Facebook. And the rationale for this, the impetus for this project, was to be able to see what is appearing in people's news feeds. We don't know why Reanna sees one thing and I see another, and no one sees the same thing. We have a hunch, we know, we have sense, but we don't actually see the algorithm that's influencing that. And so this was a way to circumvent that and to say, let's install this plugin so we can get snapshots to see actual content from actual people's news feeds. So they collected a lot of demographic data. They wanted to know the age of the people that were installing this, the political affiliations or leanings of these people, stated interests, etc. And what resulted was this robust collection of data that's emerging from people's real Facebook feeds. So we have a sense that what we've been thinking all along, that we're all seeing different news feeds, is in fact true. So if you scroll down here, you can see the three groupings that they have. The default here is women versus men, which is very interesting. So you can see if you scroll down, I think the left is the left men, is that what they're, oh, women, okay, the left is women here. This is generally, these four sources are most prevalent among women. These are 300 panelists from the last 2 weeks. You can go back to a month, and after that they remove and scrub all of the data. Another category here is you could look at Republican or Biden voters versus Trump voters, I suppose. And you can see the primary sources here. So again, nothing shocking, but if you scroll down and you look at the news stories here, you can see in real ways how coverage varies from one to the other. We all know this, students know this, they know that there are, real distinctions, but what I think makes this pressing for students is now saying, okay, by and large, you are not Facebook users anymore. You use different platforms, but your parents use Facebook, your grandparents use Facebook, your aunts and uncles might use Facebook. So let's think about what matters here if everyone is looking at different news. What's broadcast now is not the nightly news into everyone's home where we see what the top stories are. Everyone now has different stories that are deemed the top. And so thinking about the implications for that is really important when we think about this idea of civic engagement. We think of this idea of digital citizenship. Everyone is now encountering different streams of information, and we don't know truly how those streams of information are created. And so it's a really good conversation for students to think about how this plays out in society at large, not necessarily in their own lives if they're not using this platform, but how this distinction, these filter bubbles, which is a term they talk about a lot, varies from person to person, and why we should care about that.
Okay, so getting back into this, these examples, so I should mention that I also like to show the split screen to students, but actually as a sort of precursor to them talking about their own feeds. I think showing them the differences between Facebook feeds is really nice because then they like, especially having it sort of laid out in the way that split screen does, allows them to start thinking a little bit more critically about their own feeds. So after doing that activity, I tend to ask them to think about how they will, how this affects their own TikTok feeds or Instagram feeds.
So another activity that I've done with students is put them in the creator seat and ask them to think about creating an algorithm. And so inherent to that conversation is thinking about what are the data sources used in the input and output feeds when thinking about an algorithm. So at its simplest level, we can think of an algorithm like an if A, then B kind of algebra statement. And so I asked students to think about this broad topic, global climate change progress. There's, multiple avenues students could take on that, but the idea being this is a global problem and you should think about having global information sources in your results. So I tasked them with thinking about the three kind of sources that they would want to be certain would appear at the top of their results if they were doing a search. I introduced them to the United Nations Archives Search, which is another database, which is similar to Medline in that you can see what fields are indexed, what weight is given to those particular indexed metadata fields. And I tasked them with thinking about the metadata that should accompany these three sources. And they see that it's a really hard thing at first. They haven't thought about it this way, but then they see, actually, it's not that hard. If I want really good content and I know that, I want it to be recent in nature, I want it to be, it's not so hard to build a system that's transparent and does exactly as it says. And so I think this, by putting them, similar to one of the talks earlier, having the students do the cataloging, having the students think about the algorithm creation, makes them realize this is possible. It's a matter of valuing it. And where they come from that is a conclusion that the values of a lot of these companies creating these algorithms is not primarily on finding the best available evidence with the best available data. It's actually personal incentives, economic incentives, political motives that drive a lot of the underlying algorithms.
I also wanted to add, circling back to the idea of having them reflect on their own feeds. This particular activity is very adaptable to a one-shot or a subject particular session. You can have them maybe create search terms related to their course topics or assignment that they're doing for the class, and then search their social media feeds, Google, YouTube, as well as library resources, such as the catalog or library databases for resources. And then this gives you an opportunity not only to talk about different kinds of sources, but also how to evaluate them while still incorporating some of this algorithmic literacy. And another activity that you can do this with is the sort of very common searching Google images for the word beautiful. Spoiler alert, if you haven't done this before, it's predominantly able-bodied, thin, white women that come up, even if you're not including those search terms in it. And the students are really very quick to notice this, but you can definitely adapt this activity as well for a one-shot, where maybe you can search particular terms either in Google Images or in Google generally, and then compare it to how those search terms play out if you are searching another search engine such as DuckDuckGo, which isn't personalizing your results, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about this with the students in a one-shot session. Now we're going to be talking about opting out, and Ashley will take it away.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Reanna.
Sorry.
No, that's perfect. So one thing that we like to talk about with students is that the default in a lot of these social media settings is to be as grabby as possible with their data. It's not the default to be as restrictive as possible. And so that's an important thing to recognize as a user that's potentially putting a lot of data, personal data, out on these commercially driven and informed algorithmic platforms. So we talk about how do you go in and make your settings a bit more restrictive so data isn't widely available. And so these are the the links and the resources for doing that, and individual platforms. We won't go through these now, but telling students that, and really driving home the point that the intent of these companies is to monetize data. And what is that data? It's the information that you help provide, I think underscores the importance to really think critically about the information that they make available.
And because these systems are so data-driven, there's obviously an evident overlap here between privacy, because one of the best ways to sort of limit their influence on you is to better protect yourself online. During the session, students are always like, well, what can I do right now to like help me from like breaking out of these systems? And so these are just some recommendations that we give them about kind of bulking up their privacy online, turning off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, rejecting cookies, turning off location services. And they also are always like, well, what tools should I be using? So we also usually give them some recommendations for ad blockers, browsers, search engines. We do recommend library databases as not giving personalized results, and go through the sort of ways in which those work. And also the computers at Cornell have deep freeze on them, so they don't save any cookies or cache. So we also recommend those. And usually we try to leave like a little bit of time at the end of the sessions to give the students some time to like do a little bit of co-working on this, if it just so that they can kind of walk away feeling like they've done something to improve their privacy and improve and sort of break out of these systems a little bit. Moving into algorithms in the future.
Thanks. So we feel very strongly that awareness of algorithms, as Reanna nicely posed at the very start of this talk, is that algorithms are shaping in ways we know and in ways that we're not quite sure of the information that we see and use. And so understanding how that happens with very little to no regulation or oversight is an important discovery for students to have as consumers of information. So in addition to that, though, our job, we feel, is to not only teach these students about these systems and the various ways these systems influence their reality that's shaped by the information they encounter, but to also empower them to advocate for a more equitable, fair, transparent online search experience down the road, where there is more regulation and there is more oversight. So this leads us to this idea of civic engagement, which many of you I'm sure have heard about. And this idea of civic engagement is really understanding the various identities, social structures, et cetera, that influence the underlying motivations one might have to engage with issues of social importance, and the information they seek that informs how they engage with social issues. Civic engagement is also very much affected by the technological affordance, the social affordances that exist in those environments in which this engagement is playing out. And so understanding their role in that environment and advocating for more is an important element of what increasingly we're hearing is this idea of digital citizenship. And that includes aspects of information literacy, knowing how to seek information in transparent ways to refute or affirm claims that they're encountering. Understanding digital security, as we were just talking about previously, and the implications of not keeping secure your private or search history, your private information, your search history behaviors, et cetera. Thinking about this idea of digital ethics, thinking about regulation. What are the implications when the FICO score algorithm cannot be assessed at a wide scale, and how that information, the output from the FICO scale, for example, informs very real life decisions that affect a lot of people, and particularly impact in inequitable ways certain communities of color. And so thinking about their role, students' role in helping to shape and advocate for more equitable spaces is an important thing.
And to sort of round us out, I did want to share this quote from the ALA's interpretation of the Bill of Rights on privacy, which is privacy is essential to the exercise of free speech, thought, and free association. Lack of privacy and confidentiality chills users' choices, thereby suppressing access to ideas. The possibility of surveillance, whether direct or through access to records of speech, research, and exploration, undermines a democratic society. And I share this partly because, as Sarah Lambden's work has shown us, library vendors are increasingly moving into the data brokerage space and selling patron data. So just as in these sessions, we are trying to get students to think critically about how algorithms are shaping their information access, we also, as librarians, need to be thinking critically about how algorithmic systems are shaping the work that we do. While I'd love to say libraries are free from algorithmic systems, it's clear that they're not. And then to sort of round out the sessions, we do always kind of give like a rating list for students, our librarians, and also some nonprofits and community efforts in case they wanted to get involved in some other ways. And these are our references. If you'd like a copy of these slides, please feel free to email us. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. This was just a fantastic session to further the conversation from the keynote this morning. Really appreciate hearing about your work. If anybody did not get a chance to see the keynote this morning, we will be posting a recording of that to the Information Literacy Summit website in the coming weeks. And some people were asking about your slides. So if you're all interested in sharing those, you can post them here or send them to me following the session, and we will also post materials from the presentations to the Information Literacy Summit as well.
I'll email them just so
Okay,
that
great.
I can take out any notes that are on there.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, we'll be happy to post those. People were definitely interested. Well, thanks so much. Let me, I think there may be a couple questions coming into the chat, lots of positive feedback as well, lots of thanks and applause. I know, feel free to respond to any questions that you're seeing come in the chat. I did see a couple comments come in earlier that I wondered if you wanted to share your thoughts on. A couple people were commenting that you know, they found themselves having to convince students almost that privacy is important, and that they might, many students might be fine kind of like with that trade-off of privacy versus convenience. Have you found that in your sessions, or what have students' reactions been?
Yeah, I guess I can start, and then Ashley, please feel free to chime in. Yeah, I think it can be sort of overwhelming for students because a lot of times they're just constantly hearing like, the internet's bad, don't use it. But I think part of the way in which I think we try to approach this is not like these things are necessarily bad, but like understanding that they're using them and like trying to like get them to think a little bit more about like informed consent. Like, can you consent to the usage of your data? And then also like providing a better picture of exactly what that data usage looks like exactly how these data profiles are being created about you, like just like how data brokerage works with the stitching together of like your offline data, like public records about you, as well as like online data. So not only just like the data that you are giving the website, but data that they're getting from other places. Like, I think one example that I've used before, like, is if you like buy a salad from Sweet Greens and you accept their cookies, it tracks both the web, like everything that you've been doing in that online session on your browser and everything you do afterwards. And this is a salad company. So like, do they need this information? One tactic that I think works really well to get the students to like think just more critically about like how much information is out there about them. And well, actually, there's two. So there's haveibeenpwned.com, which I'll put into the chat, which kind of shows them about data breaches and like how important privacy is, especially if they're reusing passwords. And then the other one is just having them Google themselves with like the Google or DuckDuckGo themselves with the word like address or phone number. And I think like it's easy to kind of think in the abstract about like privacy, where it's like, oh, I don't care if like Facebook knows what I'm doing. But then when you're thinking about how these data points are being stitched together, it gets a little bit more like real.
Yeah, I would just add that I used to experience those kind of comments, I'd say more so maybe 3-4 years ago. Increasingly, I feel like this generation is very interested in these kinds of things, increasingly so. I think that they are caring about social issues in a way that maybe other generations didn't have to, because we weren't aware of all that was happening. So I'd see there's actually more interest from students in the last couple of years to really engage and think about these systems. I think it's when we think about information, we think about the need. Like sometimes you want what's most convenient, and making that a consideration, I think, is fair given what the need is. But I also think making these different topologies where you think about a health situation where you want to be sure you are seeing, this is my new diagnosis, I want to be sure I am getting all of the relevant information and not a filtered construct of the kind of information that someone else deemed relevant. Thinking about a scenario where you're building a house and you want to be sure that that information is not filtered so you have the most accurate. So I think creating these different topologies and making it clear that some situations it's understandable that convenience matters, but in others, particularly thinking about more vulnerable situations, communities, et cetera, that's a convenience that you're not willing to have, perhaps. And so I think that thinking about the different ways in which the context differs and the willingness to divulge information might differ as well.
Thank you. There was another question too. I'm wondering if you have ideas on how you might work with students who aren't using news as sources for research. And then a follow-up to from another, from somebody else, and what about students who don't use social media?
Well, I think social media is one aspect, and we did focus on that, but this applies to search engines like Google, which, and but also others. So bringing it back to news, you know, the New York Times, Washington Post, they're all using algorithms. They're all determining what they present to you first when you go to the homepage there. So I think that even if you're not using social media, algorithms are persistent and pervade a lot of different information platforms. So I suppose that's my initial thought. And then how to help students that aren't using news, I guess that's a bigger question. I don't know if I'm seeing intersections yet with algorithmic literacy, but Reanna, maybe you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think in terms of like, it depends on kind of what sources they're using, but I think this is like, I think algorithms and the ways in which they reflect society also kind of touch upon other things we teach as like information professionals, like about like gatekeeping of knowledge and like the bias of like academic sources. So I would say like, while maybe they're not necessarily using news sources, they may be searching Google for articles. Like I know as much as we try to pretend like students are using library databases, or even faculty, a lot of them are just searching Google or using Google Scholar. And we didn't include this into the presentation because I was trying to see if I could find a few more sources that have replicated this study, but I did find a few sources that have shown like about how Google Scholar has variation in hits depending on how you search. And I would also say like Google Scholar itself is very metrics based, and I think we all kind of can attest to the ways that metrics sometimes may not be the best gauge of like authority on a subject. Instead, it's just like who, like, because it kind of becomes a catch-22. And so those things are kind of based on similar topics that would affect a student who isn't necessarily using news in their research. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. Let's see, we're about wrapping up here. There was one last question here about, do you mention browsers too, and how it can be hard to get students to use browsers other than Chrome. Do you have any last comments on that?
Yeah, we recommend a few different browsers. We recommend Firefox for students, but also we talk a little, if there's time, we talk a little bit about Tor, the Tor project, if folks are familiar, or if they're using their phones, using the Onion browser on their phone. I will say, like, as much as I love Tor, it can actually be really difficult to use Tor for library research because part of the like sort of security of Tor is undermined when you need to authenticate with your Cornell login in order to access materials, because then that sort of surveillance is happening on that level. But we do talk about these topics. I should also mention, like, a lot of this is also kind of planting seeds for additional workshops that we give at Cornell about privacy, about data brokers. And I think if you can get the students also to see librarians as experts in their own right, they tend to then attend more of these things.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us and for engaging in the conversation with us after too and answering all these questions. Thank you so much. We've got a short break on the schedule next, and then one more breakout session that we hope to see you at. Thank you, everyone.